It's called the Mars Project in U.S. Time Travel History. I think this is of greater contemporary relevance simply because the CIA's Mars Project was 10 years later, and I encountered it not as a school child, but as an undergraduate at the University of California at Los Angeles between 1980 and 84. Part one, I'm emphasizing the fact that I'm waging one truth campaign with two goals. The first is to explain to the people of the world that we crossed through the threshold of time travel by 1970. And the second is to tell a number of things about Mars. That it's inhabited, that we've been sending U.S. chrononauts there for over 30 years, and that we have a colony there. And yet most of the people in the world were not even informed of that fact. And I think it was a fundamental human right, part of the common heritage of the human race, to know that we were in contact with another planet and its humanoid beings and animals, and that we had a right as a global polity to participate in the decision-making about this momentous moment in cosmic history. But instead, we did the same thing that we did with time travel, that is the U.S. government did, which is keep it secret down to the participants themselves. And I wasn't the first of the participants to step forward. In fact, Michael C. Ralph and Arthur Neumann, who was the Henry Deacon informant to Project Camelot, stepped forward, and then I stepped forward, and then William Brett Stilling stepped forward, Bernard Mendez, and then, of course, our friend Laura Magdalene Eisenhower then stepped forward and revealed that in 2006 and 2007, she had been invited to join the Mars colony. Let me tell you, the descendants of U.S. presidents usually don't address political issues or matters of the day. And Laura really stepped up, and it was a doozy, which was she was revealing that she had been invited to go to the Mars colony, which was extremely controversial. So I always thank Laura for her courageous testimony every time I speak about the Mars Jump Room program. Okay, so part two, what was the CIA's Jump Room program? First of all, we have to remember about the occult origins of the United States of America. I just filmed an interview for Guyam TV in Boulder, Colorado, and who should I be greeted by but the estimable researcher Jay Widener. And I had a little bit of one of those out-of-body moments where you don't expect meeting somebody in a certain location. And Jay's written and spoken extensively, here's Jay Widener on the right, about the occult Egyptian origins of the United States of America. I mean, the pyramid, the Great Pyramid, announcing a new order of the ages, being a new order of the ages, being undertaken by the Almighty, matters. I mean, it's historically significant and meaningful. What Jay has described is that the notion of the Illuminati that he espouses is that the Illuminati was the political and social conspiracy begun by the Jesuit professor Adam Weishaupt in Munich, in Bavaria, hence the Bavarian Illuminati, in 1776. And he claims that it was the Bavarian Illuminati that founded the United States of America, initially for a single purpose. And his research has revealed that that purpose was to put human beings back on Mars. Prior to the solar system catastrophe of 9500 BC, when Earth and Mars were hit by something from outer space, it may have been debris from the Vela supernova explosion, it may have been an attack by an extraterrestrial race of some kind, it may have been rocks, a tremendous amount of rocks and debris from some other celestial event. But nonetheless, we were in a three-planet confederacy with Earth, Mars, and another planet called Marduk that then disintegrated in that catastrophe and became the asteroid belt, which is really where a planet should be in our solar system, as Sir Isaac Newton demonstrated mathematically. Okay, so Jay's point here is not that the Bavarian Illuminati started the United States, but they had a specific goal, which was to create a high enough civilization to get us back on Mars. Now that would be very valuable to do because Mars is in an irregular orbit around the Sun, and hence with us, with Earth, on our regular orbit around the Sun. So if we put human beings, if we put Earthlings on both planets, if either planet is hit or destroyed or disintegrates, we've got members of our species over on whatever the other platform is, the Earth or Mars. So that's clearly a matter of celestial or cosmic security of the highest order. The other thing I'd like to point out at the beginning of discussing the Mars Jump Room program is the profoundly intelligent Richard Dolan, the ufological researcher, has written several fine books about the UFO cover-up. Bright man. he's warned us about the advent of a breakaway civilization, a civilization in which some people would be going out into outer space, but most people would not be. That they'd be functioning, the insiders would be functioning at a high level of technical development, but those developments would be kept back from the general population. They wouldn't even know about the advances. And that we would essentially evolve into a dysfunctional civilization led by sort of a priesthood of insiders. So picking up on Richie Dolan's point, I'm alleging that that's already happened. I mean, I'm not going to beat up here on Barack Obama, because actually he's a fine human being. I remember him fondly working with him in the jump room program, actually jumping with Barack Obama when he was then using his Indonesian name of Barry Sotoro. But consider the fact that Barack Obama has been elected to the highest office in the most powerful country on the planet. And the people who voted for him, in fact, the whole electorate, the American people, were not advised of the fact that he was a veteran of the secret space program. I mean, he's not responsible for that. We were basically shanghaied and placed in the project. We didn't ask to be in the project. But Barry does have this past that I have, in which we were placed in a sub-project of the secret space program that had placed several jump rooms on Mars and was sending Earthlings to Mars. Actually, if we're to cite Michael Relf, beginning in 1976, Barry and I and the others that I'm going to be introducing you today first went up in the summer of 1981. But just consider that. I mean, the presidency is an important office. He's not just the President of the United States with all the legislation that's being passed, all the funding. He's Commander-in-Chief of the most powerful military in the world. And he's the chief executive for the most powerful country. And essentially, at this point, a unipolar world, a world that is now unipolar, that may go multipolar as Russia and China and India and Brazil and so forth emerge even more, but that is still fundamentally a unipolar world, with the United States being excessively dominant in politics, military affairs, economic development, and social development, and so forth. So it's not a matter of us being worried about ultimately finding ourselves in a breakaway civilization. That civilization has arrived. We're in it. And the only thing that can cure that negative situation is if individuals who have been in these secret projects like myself come forward and reveal what happened to us. Otherwise, the public will continue to be confused and lied to and unknowledgeable about what we've really developed as an American civilization. We've done great things even beyond what we've bragged about. We haven't just gone to the moon, we've gone to Mars. Okay, we just haven't developed the fastest airplanes in the world. We've developed time travel. And I think it's time we start bragging about it. That's one of the reasons I'm running for president. I mean, this is a great civilization. I mean, we fought a civil war to remain a country and to free 4 million African American slaves living in the South, enslaved, and there were 1.5 million casualties. I was talking about the Civil War with Hesper at dinner the other night, and people don't realize that after the Civil War, the number one industry was prosthetic limbs in every town in America. That's how many people fought for the freedom of the African peoples in America. So we have things to brag about, and we don't brag about them. And one of the things we're not bragging about at all is what we've achieved in the area of high technology. We're keeping our most profound technical feats, our most advanced technical feats, secret, because secrecy confers the advantage of using or not using them, but never revealing that they exist. Okay, so as President of the United States, I'm going to try to advance our public understanding of technology, advance it per se, but certainly lead the disclosure campaign, the disclosure effort, to tell the people of this country what's been done with both their tax dollars and monies that have been diverted from corporations to escape congressional scrutiny of the things that we've developed. We've not only been sending adults and children in time space in different ways since 1970, we have created a colony on Mars, and we're still talking about the lunar landing 44 years after it occurred. Okay, so we are in a breakaway civilization, and I, for one, don't want future Americans to be living in a country where a small group of scientists, government administrators, and astronauts and chrononauts know what we've achieved and what we're doing. I mean, the Mars program should have been something that was as highly touted as the lunar landing, but it was shoved under the rug. So I'm taking it out from under the rug, and I'm telling everybody. And have I succeeded? Yeah. I've gotten 150 million listener units just from the 5 appearances on Coast to Coast AM with George Nord. When I was interviewed by the talented Jaime Jose Mozan, the Mexican TV journalist, he's sort of the Mike Wallace of Mexico, that was seen by 10 million people I discussed the Mars program extensively in that interview. That was seen by 10 million Mexicans and 40 million other Latin Americans right after one of the biggest soccer games in the whole soccer yearly calendar in the world. So the information is getting out, and I have not been assassinated. Okay, so clearly there's a big faction within the U.S. permanent secret government and intelligence community that shares my belief that this stuff should be publicized and not hidden. So I mentioned serving with Barry Obama in the Mars Jump Room program. He was in our training class at College of the Siskiyous in 1980 under Ed Dames, as is confirmed by myself, William Stillings, and Bernard Mendez. We roomed for a couple days at the dorms at College of the Siskiyous before we all moved over to the Finlandia Motel in Shasta City, in the city of Mount Shasta. We sometimes encountered each other at 999 North Sepulveda, which was where the West Coast Jump Room was. And we were sometimes in the jump room together, because usually two were in the jump room. In terms of oxygen, our oxygen requirements, you're either jumping by yourself or one other team member. And we were both on the surface together and under Bernard Mendez on some exploratory jumps, just as I was sometimes put with Courtney Hunt being the team leader with William Stillings. They were putting sort of a seasoned, older jumper with two younger jumpers, and so I was actually sometimes teamed with Barry in exploratory missions on the surface of Mars. So I just wanted to point out that, but also just there's a question of why they would have put veritably one, possibly two future presidents in the same program where they were going to Mars. Maybe we can talk about that during the break, because there's many explanations for that. I mean, that they were just getting a season to stressful events, that the Mars program was going to widen into a program in which the president would announce the arrivals of the Martians that are like us to emigrate here to Earth, where conditions are so much more convivial to life, that the Mars program would become a big matter of presidential concern. We don't know, but they at least involved one future president, and they spoke of me also as being a future president during the training class in summer of '80, so it looks like two future presidents were involved, and they were literally risking our lives to do it, so it was obviously a priority. Okay, I mentioned yesterday about Project Pegasus, which I was in from 1968 to 72, how it was under DARPA, the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, that gave us Star Wars weaponry and the internet. And I think that, to the extent that we were conscripted into the Mars program, I think probably my involvement in Pegasus as a time traveler from age 7 to 11, or age 6 actually to 11, here I'm at age 5 in kindergarten, was clearly the basis for involving me in the program. I think I was basically viewed as a time-space veteran at that point, but I don't know. We were never told why we were admitted into the Mars program. I talked about yesterday how Project Pegasus involved us in remote viewing, where we were looking for John McCain among other targets, spinning, in which we were being spun on our backs at clockwise 33 at 33 rotations per minute and going out of body to sort of explore the matrix. We talked about the Montauk chair that Hesper and I experienced as school children at 10 years apart, and how it was essentially had a magnetic transducer on the back where we alternately had an astral projection to our future, as I did, or I was looking at an external feed of my inner thinking on a video display terminal when they were using me in the Montauk chair in 1979-80 when I was a freshman at UC San Diego before transferring to UCLA. And then Hesper talked about, or I don't know if we talked about enough, the fact that you think there was also a video display terminal connected to your apparatus, but that the lady working with you was not letting you see it. She was kind of guiding you through your exploration of the future.
Yeah, knowing that by the time you were college age, there was a video in front of you.
Right.
I could only guess that when she was coming out from behind me, that if there was a screen, it was behind me, because there wasn't one in front of me.
Right, but she
Yeah.
seemed to be looking at something as if it
Yeah,
was another attachment.
she was
to
doing
the device.
something,
Yeah.
some sort of controls, maybe the driving. Yeah.
Right, now the benefit of the advantage of the Montauk chair was that the time travelers stayed in the chair
Right.
when their mind went forward. So if they could then literally guide the person. I had mentioned yesterday how, they debrief you about what you saw, and they say, oh, where were you? Oh, I was in my apartment in Vancouver, Washington. What was going on? Oh, the TV was on. who was on the TV, the president, what was he doing, giving the State of the Union address, who was the president, Barack Obama, okay? The benefit of doing that kind of psychic driving, that seems to be what went on where she was watching the video terminal, I think, was that if you were in your house or apartment a certain year in the future, she could literally say, go over to the television set. And they were actually sort of, at that point, 10 years into the use of children in the Montauk chair, almost doing kind of a chronovision type scoping of your environment, because that's how they were deriving information about the future, was by debriefing the child after 15 or 20 minutes in the chair. And also, there was no OBE, like when I started. There was no OBE when I was at UC San Diego. I was just in the chair, and they were asking me to go forward in time to a certain time period, and it was there, right on the screen, what I was thinking. And that's where I revealed the names of Bill Clinton and Al Gore as president and vice president in the 2 terms before the turn of the century, which is now 13 years ago. Right, we entered that. But so yeah, here we have in the accounts from Hesper and I corroborating evidence that the Montauk chair existed or exists. They were using school children in it, and there were advances in the technical nature of the technology where they could literally sort of begin using it sort of like as a chronovisor to actually have the Montauk E go wherever they wanted them to go within their future event. So we talked about that. This is just kind of a recap. I talked about the Tesla teleporter, these 2 parenthesis-shaped objects between which radiant energy that Tesla had discovered would be broadcast. And when you jump through it physically, your inertia opened up a vortal tunnel in time-space, and then when that tunnel closed, you were somewhere else on the face of the planet, with either in real time or an adjustment in time. And that goes to my point about these vortal tunnels being used for time travel. Imagine you're jumping through Nikola Tesla Grand Central Teleport in New York City. You're popping out at Ernetti and Gemelli Union Teleport in Los Angeles in real time with an actual real displacement of several seconds. You're not, let's say, being sent 10 years into your past. Okay, we don't want to use this for time travel. Then the chronovisor. I talked about seeing the actual signing of the U.S. Constitution on September 17th of 1787. I talked about the advanced chronovisor, where we went up to ITT Defense Communications in Nutley, New Jersey, and were sent in this spacesuit, basically this titanium-covered jumpsuit and crystal helmet, and we were sent forward to the year 2013 to see what condition the U.S. Supreme Court building was in. And then we were pulled back another half hour, and I was disrobed there on the stage, and as I walked past Elaine Gallagher, my team leader, my facilitator back in my elementary school, I said, "Where is my dad?" And she came up to me and said, "Oh, Andy, he had to leave and be by himself for a while." And I said, "Why, Elaine?" And he said, "Well, it's kind of hard to describe to you, but when we turned the crystal array on, which generated the hologram, which was much brighter than even the one that we encountered over at Morristown," she said, "you all disappeared from the stage, and your father thought that you were gone, son." And so when I finally was debriefed by the Office of Naval Intelligence down the hall and was reunited with my dad, there were still tears in his eyes. Because what he saw was that the 5 or 6 kids that had been literally connected to these metal stanchions on the stage, their uniform, our jumpsuits, our sort of time-space protective suits, similar to what the astronauts would wear, disappeared. In fact, the connecting loops to the stanchions, they said literally, my dad later said, they literally fell as we disappeared. And my dad thought, "Oh great, I've just involved my youngest child, my 5th child, in U.S. time-space research and development activity, and I just led to his demise." So my dad was literally just really shook up. But I was asked by the lieutenant commander for the Office of Naval Intelligence, who had an office down the hall from this large auditorium where the device was. And he said, "Okay, Andrew, tell me what you saw." And I said, "I saw a building." He said, "What kind of building?" "Oh, like this big stone building with columns in the front, kind of like a Roman temple." Because we had been sort of inculcated in Western civilization on the speed learning machines called the tachistoscopes, the curriculum that was called Galileo, which covered developments in science and society from 1450. And he said, "Well, tell me about the building." And I said, "Well, I know it's under fresh water because I could see that green stuff that grows in ponds on the columns." And he said, "You mean algae?" And I said, "Yeah, algae." And when I said that it was underwater and had algae on the columns, he actually got up. He spilled the ice water that he was serving me all over his table, all over his desk there in his study-like, book-lined office. And he then began smoking and pacing back and forth in his office. Okay, so these kinds of findings were highly disturbing the United States government. Could it be an accident, therefore, that from 1970 to 1980, the United States government moved 1/3 of the United States population west of the Mississippi? I don't think so. I think they were preparing for that. In 1960, 2/3 of Americans lived east of the Mississippi. By 1980, only 1/3 of the American people lived east of the Mississippi. They moved 1/3 of our population west of the Mississippi in a decade after making findings like this. Has it happened yet in 2013? No, but then again, I left the timeline in which this was detected. And then a large teleport is called a Stargate. That term is actually used. There was a large black one set up in the summer of '72 in the gymnasium at the Cerrillos Cultural Center outside of Santa Fe in the town of Cerrillos near Madrid, New Mexico. And there was also a chronovisor that in the summer of '71 was put in the back of the building where there's a symphony orchestra stage, and that was the chronovisor they were using to send me to the Lincoln shooting site, Ford's Theater, on April 14th of 1865. So that's what a Stargate is. It's nothing but a big teleporter. And in fact, it prompted the same kind of vortal tunnel. I talked about how arriving in this industrial park in 2045 and walking into this immaculate building to retrieve microfilm summaries of events occurring between the 1970s and 2040s, and then jumping through the wall of a conference room to get back to the Lobo Overlook site in southwest Colorado, where there are microwave transmitters. I talked about the plasma confinement chamber, this large lucite box about half the size of a tennis court and about 15 feet high, and how they sent me to Gettysburg on the day that Abraham Lincoln gave the Gettysburg Address, and I ended up being photographed there by the famed Civil War photographer Matthew Brady, as found by the photoanalyst Josephine Cobb at the Library of Congress, Josephine being the great aunt of my fellow Mars jumper, William Stillings, whose mother is Gail Cobb Stillings. Now, that gets us to the jump rooms. The jump rooms were clearly present in Project Pegasus, but oddly, Bernard Mundez, or not so oddly, has said that they were given to us by one faction of the great ETs. There were two, one in New York City and one in El Segundo, California. Here is Imperial Avenue East and West, and here is the address that gives it the address 999 North Sepulveda, which is Sepulveda Boulevard. And right here is the bottom, that is to say the southern perimeter of the Los Angeles International Airport. So next time you enter LAX, there's that turnabout right in the front, and there's that space-age restaurant there in the center of the site plan. Look over to the southern periphery and go, hey, that's the building where they were jumping Andy and his fellow U.S. chrononauts to Mars. What was the jump room? It was the elevator of the building. The elevator had a dual use. And we would go up from the interior of the building where the elevator landing was, up to the 5th floor, go into the 5th floor, which was basically like, it just housed like a Fijian suite, like you have at a law firm, where you have a sort of a fancy counter and different offices. There was always one person working for CIA there who would have us write our name, sign it, give our ID number, which for me was my UCLA student ID number, had been entered in their system, 700-414-879. Please don't publish that. But so we would also give our date of birth. Then we would go up to the top floor, the 8th floor, and in the elevator we would feel the elevator moving sideways from the center of the building. And it was moving always in this direction. When I was filming a segment with Bill Ryan and Carrie Cassidy at Project Camelot, Carrie noticed from our location here out in this parking lot to the southwest corner of 999 North Sepulveda that there was a strange apparatus on the back of the building. And I think it takes a perceptive person to see that, but basically we think that may have been the housing that the elevator was moved into, and then whatever was operating the jump room was then masked by this air conditioning unit beneath it, because we were clearly making a horizontal translation after arriving on the 8th floor. We would stand there for 5, 10, 15 minutes, and then whoever was handling that jump would say something to us on the intercom. And the first time I went up in July of 1981, it was Courtney Hunt, who had trained me in Chatsworth, California, for my, after Ed Dames had handled us in 1980. I was placed with Courtney Hunt because he was a senior CIA and an experienced Mars jumper. And he kept asking me whether I was ready. And I finally said, after the third time, and he said over the intercom, "Are you ready, Andy? You're going to Mars. Are you cognizant of what's happening? Are you relaxed? Whatever." I finally said, "Come on, Courtney, light this candle." Citing Alan Shepard when he was on the tarmac there at Cape Canaveral, waiting to go up into space the first time as an American astronaut. So I finally was sent to Mars there after waiting. The rectangular or box-like elevator would then morph into a cylinder. So Courtney had described how I was going to have to sort of reach out with my left arm and stabilize myself so I wouldn't fall over. He said, just like going through a water main, you want to know that it's going to become cylindrical. So nothing would happen. We would see the lights blinking in light panels inside the jump room, inside the elevator. About 5 minutes later, we could see that the box-like elevator was then morphing into a cylinder, with the top translated forward into the end of the cylinder where we could see kind of a wormholing going on. And that would get most intense and would sometimes nauseate the jumpers at about 10 minutes into the maximum wormholing, with all the torsional effects, because not just the jump room, but we were being sort of twisted, we think, at the same time, although I could still always see my fellow jumpers. But it was really most difficult to withstand at about 10 minutes, and then the process would start reversing and sort of becoming less and less affecting of how we felt. And then about 5 minutes after it started twisting, we would just be standing there in a box again, and then 5 minutes later the doors would open up, and we were always in a subterranean chamber on Mars, and then would take one flight of stairs up to the surface. All of the jump rooms were sort of hanging in an elevator-like contraption on Mars, 1 story below ground. So there were 5 foreshadowings of my experience in the jump room program. So let me just go through those very quickly, and maybe we can take a short 5-minute break. In 1967-68, when I first teleported to Santa Fe with my father, he came home from his job on Wall Street in New York City for the Ralph M. Parsons Company, and had a couple drinks, was in sort of a comedic mood, and he said, "Come on, everybody, let's gather in the living room. I want to tell you about this funny story where this person was talking about life forms on Mars for the first time. It's really funny. I mean, it's worthy of Art Buchwald." He said something like that. And what my dad I now know was reading, to his great delight, was several pages of excerpts from my 2008 paper, The Discovery of Life on Mars, which is 41 single-spaced pages. But he just had a couple sheafs of paper. And he was becoming hysterical, basically, reading the most fanciful and farcical passages from that paper. If you read my paper, it's online at projectmars.net, if you haven't read it. Essentially, somebody had kind of gone through it, somebody at CIA probably with a fine-tooth comb, and taken out about a page and a half of excerpts that were the excerpts that I included, the passages that I included in my paper, so that school children could relate to what I was talking about. I mean, I called this animal that I got from one of NASA's images on Mars, which looks like a cross between a puppy dog and a sponge in the ocean, a woofie, just as a reference to this dog-like creature that looked like something you could scrub with or whatever. And so my dad was reading all of those passages, and only those passages, in an attempt, I think, by somebody at CIA to confuse my father about the significance of the paper. Okay, so I did something that I had never done before and have never done since, and it was my dad. I was raised old school, so really, my dad was a disciplinarian, and I was certainly being an obedient child growing up. And what I did was I ran across the living room and I snatched the writing out of his paper. It was in a manila folder, and it was stapled to the right side, several pages. And I still remember to this day, it said, "Central Intelligence Agency Memorandum, in regard to Andrew Basiago / hyphen, the discovery of life on Mars, hyphen, 2008. So here we have evidence at the very time that I had begun teleporting back and forth between New Jersey and New Mexico, the CIA was already using quantum access to derive artifacts of future invention. In this case, my 2008 paper, The Discovery of Life on Mars. But for some reason, they were deceiving my dad about its significance, which is not we can't answer. Then about a year later, towards summertime in 1969, I'd been in Project Pegasus. I would be put in Project Pegasus officially the next fall, in September, October of 1969. My dad's giving me my regular crew cut up in one of the bedrooms of the house. He goes over to his valise from work. He takes out a manila envelope with the red wax seal and tie string and unties it. It had already been cracked open. And he pulls out basically this image, which is one of the first images that I've revealed of humanoid life forms on Mars. This is essentially the iconic image on the middle of Tsiolkovsky Ridge, which is in the West Valley of the Columbia Range within the Gusev crater of Mars. And it's a little blurry here when it's shown via a PowerPoint projector, but it basically shows a humanoid. Here's the back of his head. Here's the back of his upper torso. You can see his right armpit there, and when you look at it, the original, you can see his arm here. He's interacting with smaller humanoids over here, perhaps children, and he's wearing pants that are cinched up over where we would put them, a couple inches up into the lower back, with a brown belt, and then his legs are either in the ground or in water, or he's kneeling. And this was the first image of a humanoid being on another planet ever published on Earth. And I released a number of them in that 2008 paper. And I spent all of 2008 going over one NASA image from Mars, which is PIA 10214, and I found dozens and dozens and dozens of life forms and ancient artifacts just in that one picture. It's as if they had, or we were examining like the Yosemite of Mars, and there were people camping, hiking, and fishing in the image. It's a very rich image. So my dad had a little colloquy with me about this image in 1969, and he said, "Take a look at this, Andy." And I said, "What is it?" And he said, "It's a Martian." And I go, "What do you mean a Martian?" He said, "A humanoid like us, but on the planet Mars." And I said, "Really?" He said, "Yeah, it actually is. Guess who finds it in the future?" And I said, "Who, Dad?" And he goes, "You do." And I said, "I do?" And he said, "Yeah, NASA sends some rovers up there and starts sending the pictures back, and you go through them, and you find the first images ever published on Earth of humanoids on another planet, and you publish them in a paper, and it's a significant paper in natural history." I said, "Really, Dad?" He goes, "Yeah. So the government just wanted me to show it to you." And then he completed the rest of my haircut. So I was given a foreshadowing of the discovery of what we call the humanoid being on Tsiolkovsky Ridge. 1970, my dad says, "Come on with me, Dad." He yells out to my mom again, "Han, I'm taking Andy to the hardware store in Florham Park." He says, "Okay, Han, drive safely." And we don't drive to the hardware store in Florham Park. My dad explains in the car that we're going to be driving up to Curtiss-Wright Aeronautical Company in Wood Ridge, New Jersey. And I say, "We are, Dad? Are we going to be jumping, teleporting to New Mexico again?" He goes, "No, son. There are some Martians up there who want to meet you." And for the next 15 minutes to Curtiss-Wright, I keep on plying my dad with these questions about, well, what are they? And he actually took his Volkswagen and parked it on the side of the road and said, "Son, they are Martians. They are human beings like us from Mars, and you're going to be meeting them. They want to meet you." Now, I'm using these images, so we go over to Curtiss-Wright. We go to the left. There's a landing dock here. And at the edge of the landing dock in this big hangar, there's a reverse teardrop-shaped, silver-colored, conventional spacecraft that's just hovering there and making some basic noise of a combustion type engine or reciprocating engine. It's just going pop, 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 like a Volkswagen sitting out on an ice floe or something, when somebody's ice fishing or something. And but we go to the left. We don't go towards the ship. The ship was about the size of, I don't know, a Camaro, or maybe even one of those MG midget. I mean, it was a small. Had it been an automobile, it certainly would have been on the smaller side of automobiles. And maybe about the size of a contemporary Prius, about that size compact car. But we go over on the left, and there's a couple other earthling aerospace engineers like my dad with their black ties and their pen holders and their white shirts, and 3 Martian astronauts who looked, for the most part, absolutely human. And they looked over at me and smiled. There were two that were tall and bald, and one who were about 6'1" or 2", and then all male, with the oldest one being shorter and more professorial looking, more like an intellectual than a soldier or an aviator. And he looked kind of like, I mean, the 2 larger ones kind of looked like the actor Telly Savalas, but maybe the shorter one looked like the actor Larry Neal of the Three Stooges, kind of with a bald head, but with a crown of brown hair and a kind of prominent nose. And the professor looked over at me and said, "Oh, he's a handsome lad," in a high voice, like when we're on, we breathe helium and then try to speak. And they just kind of smiled at me, and then they wrapped up the meeting, and they walked across my dad and I down a set of steps to the end of that loading dock where their little conventional spacecraft was putting. And the last one of the taller guys, stopped in front of my father and in perfect, unaccented American English said, "Ray, it was a privilege visiting your beautiful planet again, and a pleasure to meet you. Thank you for introducing us to your son Andrew. I hope that next time we come to your planet, your exceptional planet, we can meet again." Utterly graciously, my dad, who was from rural Pennsylvania, and not the natural diplomat, as it were, said, "Oh, well, great." I don't know if he used his name, but he said, "Well, I hope that happens. That would be wonderful." And they exchanged sort of these pleasantries. And then they were all holding like a machine, maybe like a respirator. And then they walked into their craft, and my dad said, "I don't know how 3 guys can stand being in that small craft for 24 hours. So somebody has to do the range of how fast that ship could go to Mars in any of its positions relative to Earth. It would be a range of speeds because of the range of distances between Earth and Mars during the 2-year cycle of Mars relative to Earth, relative to its proximity to Earth. But it was a small ship. So the ship putters across the floor of the hangar and out onto this huge runway, as it were, there at Curtiss Wright. And one of my dad's colleagues says, "Now watch this, Andrew," as the ship's coming around its first turn. He goes, "Get ready, it's going to be impressive." And that ship started moving down a runway, like when like on a race track, a track and field racetrack, you've got an oval, but then also a straightaway. So the thing goes around the oval and then gets on the straightaway, and just moved off the tarmac with such speed that, to me, as an 8-year-old Earthling child, thought that it had actually disintegrated. It was like a flash of silver paint. It was that fast. It just went zoom and disappeared into the sky. I didn't even see it going. We just saw this flash of silver color. Now, I'm using Jackie Coogan as Uncle Fester on the Addams Family, and Mike Myers as Dr. Evil in the Austin Powers film to demonstrate what we've been subjected to for the last 50 years. Does anybody disagree about my opinion that for the last 50 years or so, we have seen this type of human being over and over and over again in the mass media? Not just Uncle Fester, but Telly Savalas as Kojak, but Mike Myers in feature films with the same kind of character. A human being that is bald, has a face that is larger than an ordinary human being, and that is intelligent, but with a kind of a kooky, recondite personality. That's like a meme in contemporary media of the latter half of the 20th century. I use this to demonstrate the 3 Martian astronauts that we met there in summer of '70, because I don't have their pictures, but then again, all of us have their pictures because it's been shoved down our throat now for 50 years. They've been grooming us to get ready for the general introduction of Martians into our civilization on Earth. 1971, my mom let me trick-or-treat when I had a severe cold. It developed into bronchitis, and later in November, as I was recuperating in our guest bedroom, which we would use as our sick room in the house, there was 5 kids and my parents, so we would segregate whoever was ill. I have this bad case of bronchitis that to some extent I may still have, but my dad, I can hear 2 sets of my in-laws down in the living room with my parents, 2 of my aunts and uncles and their children, and my 4 older brothers and sisters. There's like 20, 25 people in the house, maybe more like around 20. My dad sort of sneaks up the stairs into the guest bedroom, again takes something, some written word, out of a manila envelope with the red wax seal already being broken, the tie string, and he says, Andy, I know you're sick, but there's something I want you to read. And I said, well, what is it, Dad? He came over to the bed, and he said, take a look at it. It's a paper that you write in the future. And I said, really? He goes, yeah. Read the title there. I said, The Discovery of Life on Mars. And he goes, when do you write it? And I go, well, the copyright says 2008. And he goes, right. And how old are you going to be, son, in 2008? And I said, being one of the kids in Pegasus, I said, 47, right? And I then said, but Dad, what's the D? And he goes, well, you apparently take as your confirmation name a name that starts with D. So here you're writing as a 47-year-old and you're using the middle initial D, which I selected Daniel as my confirmation name. And I use it professionally as with the abbreviation of D. So he sat down then on the edge of my bed and said, son, this is a very important exercise. I'm going to go away for a couple hours, and I want you to read the entire paper. It's 41 pages. I want you to scrutinize the photographs. Spend time literally looking at the photographs and understanding what you're seeing. And then read the captions and try to relate the text and the captions to the photographs. And I said, why, Dad? And he said, well, the purpose of this exercise is to have you read your paper from the future about life on Mars. So when you write it in 2008 as a 47-year-old, it'll contain as much information about life on Mars, as much data, he said, about life on Mars as possible. So that made sense at that time with the reckoning of engineers like my dad who were, seeing that the internet used .com and speculating that it could indicate a total communist takeover of the United States. They were really just grasping at the straws of the future, right? And he's telling me that the purpose of this exercise is to gather as much data as possible so you'll include it when you analyze a NASA photograph and publish that paper, 37 years from that time period. And the problem is that that's a kind of a quantum paradox. Because how could I read the ultimate result of my authorship and deliver anything more than the total content of that paper? I mean, he didn't put me under trance hypnosis or something, right, under hypnotic trance. He basically was giving me the artifact from the future. How, by reading something in the future, are you influenced in a way that would cause you to put more content into the ultimate artifact? It doesn't make sense. But then again, this is the incomplete understanding of both retro and proto-causation that they were incompletely grasping. But I did read the whole paper, and when I spent 3.5 weeks in December of 2012, or actually November and December of 2012, listening to Dave Brubeck, the Dave Brubeck Quartet, listening basically to Paul Desmond, the alto saxophonist for the Dave Brubeck Quartet, playing Take 5 over and over again, summing up the work that I had done from January of 2008, finding specific details of life on, of ancient artifacts and biological beings, basically ancient life and modern life on Mars. So when it came time during a blizzard in Portland, Oregon, to be sitting in that little house on Russell Street in Portland, I basically put myself into a trance state with Take 5, where I was sleeping from 6 in the morning to noon and working 18 hours a day on the paper. And I was just out of my mind. I actually left that house, that rental house, to go to the post office and mail my paper to the chairman of the National Geographic, or the president of the National Geographic, John Sweeney. And when I came back from that short mile or so jaunt on like 6 feet of snow back to my house, I tested my fasting blood glucose, and it was 99 in the middle of the day. Because all I survived on for those 3.5 weeks while putting myself into this creative fugue with the playing of Take 5 on YouTube was a ham, 18 eggs, and like 28 cups of coffee. Hespers, I know. rolling her eyes about the bad health of that. But basically, I went on a ham, eggs, and coffee diet as I was listening to the Dave Brubeck Quartet play Take 5. And that allowed me to sort of synthesize everything I'd studied that year, but who knows what I was actually getting from memory from having read my own paper. Anyway, I then widened my diet after the publication of the paper. And another thing that happened was kind of a precursor to my own involvement in the Mars project, when I was on Project Pegasus, I was frequently in the presence of a woman named Mary Constance Chavez, who was also known as Connie Chavez or Pilly. And she was kind of almost a folkloric figure in Old Town Albuquerque. She was sort of the belle star of Old Town Albuquerque. Because for many years, she held the position of cashier and waitress at the La Hacienda restaurant and the La Placida restaurants, the two most famous Mexican restaurants in all of Albuquerque. I heard recently that the La Hacienda was shut down, but I think the La Placida is still there. But then and now, there were very famous restaurants in the whole Southwest, and Connie was sort of like the greeter, and she was always spinning one-liners when people would say something. So she became sort of famous there in that context. She was born there, she grew up there, she died in Albuquerque. But one time, she was babysitting me in 1972. I was 10, 11 years old. I was just hanging out in the restaurant. And my dad came back from a technical meeting that had lasted from like around lunchtime to 2 o'clock. And as he walked into the La Hacienda, he looked like he'd been punched in the stomach. He looked ill and green around the gills. And so Connie started talking to him. He said, "No, let's go over here out of earshot of Andy." And they went in the far corner of the restaurant. And then I did the things that any of you who have had kids know, that when kids want to be in on a meeting, they're going to get there. Sometimes they'll get there directly, but often they'll do the zigzag. So I stopped at one of the tables. They didn't see me. And then I did the Bart Simpson over here. And I basically zigzagged across the floor of the restaurant, and I heard Connie say to my father, does he go there before or after he publishes all the pictures of the creatures up there? So that must have been the meeting in which my dad was told, "Hey, your son that you volunteered in the Pegasus, we like working with him. When we get operational for Mars, he's going." Because my dad literally looked ill, and that's what Connie said. So there, in 1972, they were talking about what Rumsfeld must have meant when I was on Pegasus. When my dad was drinking his Jack Daniels, Donald Rumsfeld his martini, and me my grape knee-high, and Rumsfeld said to my father, "No, Ray, what we plan to do is send him to the Naval Academy in Annapolis, and then spin them through that, and use that use the Naval Academy as a pretext for involving them in future project activities." Well, my dad sat me down in high school and explained how I was going to the Naval Academy. I turned him down. I went to UCSD and then UCLA. But there in 72, my dad had just been briefed that I was headed for Mars. So now we have some connection here between being in Pegasus, Rumsfeld knowing in 72, but before 72, which is when I left Project Pegasus, that the kids were heading for the Naval Academy, as I would be apprised of 5 years later in 1977. And when I stepped out of my interview by my local congressman, Barry Goldwater Jr., his secretary actually called me up on the phone and chewed me out for 15 minutes. "Don't you know who you had an interview with? He's one of the 453 members of Congress and all this. He's your local congressman." So Alfred Weber believes that it was not going to Annapolis is where I really started my truth campaign, or my resistance to government secrecy, as it were, and tyranny. But we know that my dad was briefed probably about Mars based on what Connie said in 1972. So with that, let's take a break of about five minutes, and I'll come back and I'll start talking about the training program I was put in the summer of 1980 at College of the Siskiyous in Weed, California.